The phone call came at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. Warren Beatty's publicist, voice shaking. "We have a problem. Janet Morrison, at the Times, has the story." Beatty was silent for 3 seconds. "Which story?" "The producer's wife. The hotel. The photographs. Everything." The story was devastating. Proof. Witnesses. Photographs that couldn't be explained away. The kind of scandal that ends careers, ruins marriages, destroys reputations. The Times was running it Sunday. Front page. Janet Morrison's byline. She'd been investigating for 6 weeks. Every source confirmed. Every detail verified. Beatty's publicist was already drafting crisis statements, planning damage control, preparing for the fallout. Beatty said 5 words. "What's Janet's cell number?" He hung up, made one call. 30 seconds. "Janet, it's Warren. Coffee tomorrow morning." That was Friday night. Sunday morning, the story didn't run. Monday, it still hadn't appeared. By Wednesday, people started asking questions. What happened to the Janet Morrison story? Everyone had heard she had something big on Beatty. Janet Morrison said she was pursuing other leads. The story wasn't ready yet. Maybe next month. It never ran. That's when Hollywood realized Warren Beatty didn't kill stories by threatening journalists. He had coffee with them. If you understand why some stories die not because they're false, but because the person writing them decides they shouldn't exist, you're in the right place. This isn't about Warren Beatty buying silence or threatening lawsuits. This is about Warren Beatty understanding that some relationships are more valuable than any story. Because in 1979, when the biggest scandal of his career was about to destroy everything, Beatty made one phone call to one person, and the entire crisis disappeared without a single word of negotiation. To understand how that worked, you need to understand how entertainment journalism actually operated in the 1970s. Journalists had power. Real power. They could make or break careers with one story. Studios couldn't control them. Publicists couldn't stop them. Lawyers could slow them down but not silence them. If a major newspaper had the story was running, period. Stars would try everything, threaten lawsuits, offer exclusive interviews, have their agents call editors, have studio heads pressure publishers. Sometimes it worked, usually it didn't. Because journalists protected their sources and their stories, especially journalists like Janet Morrison, who'd built a career on not being intimidated by Hollywood power. She was the one you feared, the one who couldn't be bought, the one whose reputation was built on publishing what others killed. If Janet Morrison had your story, you were done. Except if you were Warren Beatty, and if you dated Janet Morrison for 7 months. In 1972, they'd met at a fundraiser. She was covering politics, not entertainment. Sharp, fearless, completely unimpressed by celebrity. That's what attracted him. She didn't care about his movies, didn't care about his reputation, treated him like a person, not a commodity. They dated seriously, exclusively, even talked about important things. She introduced him to journalists, who taught him how media really worked. He introduced her to filmmakers, who taught her how Hollywood really operated. It ended amicably when she got promoted to the Washington Bureau. Geography, timing, no drama. They stayed friends. She'd call him occasionally, ask about projects, get his read on political stories she was working on. He'd recommend sources, provide context, never asking for anything in return, just friendship. Real friendship that had survived the end of romance. 7 years later, Janet Morrison was back in Los Angeles, entertainment editor, running the Times Hollywood coverage, and she had a story about Warren Beatty that could end his career. When Beatty called her Friday night, she almost didn't answer. She knew what the call was about, knew he'd heard, knew he was about to do what everyone does, threaten, plead, or offer something. She answered. Because they were friends, and friends take calls even when they know it's going to be uncomfortable. Coffee tomorrow morning, no mention of the story, No panic, no aggression, just an invitation. They met at a quiet place in Santa Monica, 8 a.m., away from industry eyes. Beatty didn't bring a lawyer, didn't bring his publicist, came alone. Janet arrived with her notes, ready to defend her reporting, ready to explain why the story was solid and running. Beatty ordered coffee, asked about her father. He was sick. They talked about that for 10 minutes. Then he asked about the Washington Bureau. She missed it, the politics, the real stories, not celebrity gossip. This isn't gossip, she said. This is documented behavior. I know, Beatty said. Your reporting is solid. It always is. She waited for the but. It didn't come. Can I ask you something? Beatty said. Sure. If you run this story, what happens? You mean what happens to you? No, what happens to everyone? Janet paused. She'd been prepared for denial, for threats, for offers, not for that question. The producer's marriage ends, Beatty continued. His wife gets humiliated publicly. Their kids see it. Your paper gets great circulation numbers for a week. I survive because I always do. And 6 months from now everyone forgets, except the people whose lives got destroyed. Janet said nothing. I'm not asking you to kill the story because of me, Beatty said. I'm asking if that's the kind of journalist you want to be. The one who ruins lives for circulation numbers. He finished his coffee, put money on the table. It's your call, Janet. It always was. I just wanted to remind you that you're better than this story. He left. Janet sat there for an hour. The story was solid. The reporting was excellent. It deserved to run. But Beatty was right about one thing. She'd gotten into journalism to expose corruption and injustice, not to destroy marriages for entertainment value. She went back to her office, looked at the photographs, read the sources, asked herself the question, is this news or is this gossip? The answer made her uncomfortable. By Monday morning, she'd told her editor the story needed more work. She wanted to reframe it, focus on industry patterns, not individual incidents. The editor pushed back. This is a front-page story about Warren Beatty. This is 8 sources gossiping about a consensual affair, Janet said. That's not the journalist I want to be. She killed her own story, not because Beatty threatened her, not because he offered her anything, not because she was protecting an ex-boyfriend, because he'd reminded her why she became a journalist in the first place. And this story didn't serve that purpose. The industry went crazy trying to figure out what happened. Beatty had been caught, dead to rights. Photographs, multiple witnesses, a journalist who couldn't be bought, and somehow the story disappeared. Rumors spread. Beatty had paid the Times. Beatty had threatened a lawsuit. Beatty had dirt on Janet Morrison. None of it was true, but no one believed the truth, that Beatty had a 20-minute coffee with a friend, and she'd decided on her own that the story wasn't worth running, because in Hollywood, that kind of power didn't exist. Power was money, threats, or leverage. Nobody understood relationship power, the kind where someone makes a decision because they respect you, not because they fear you. Other stars watched what happened and tried to replicate it. They'd reach out to journalists covering their scandals, try to have coffee, try to connect personally. It never worked the same way, because they were doing it as a tactic. Beatty had done it as a continuation of genuine relationship. Janet Morrison knew Beatty wasn't manipulating her, because 7 years of friendship before this crisis proved he wasn't someone who built relationships just to exploit them later. He'd never asked her for anything before, never used their relationship professionally, never tried to influence her coverage. So when he asked her to consider the impact of her story, she knew it wasn't self-serving manipulation. It was a friend, reminding her of her own values. That's the difference between tactical technique and genuine relationship. Within 6 months, Janet Morrison left entertainment coverage, went back to political journalism, won a major award for her coverage of congressional corruption. Years later, in an interview, she was asked about the story that didn't run. Sometimes the best journalism is knowing which stories serve the public interest and which ones just serve circulation. I'm proud I learned that before I became the journalist I didn't want to be. She never mentioned Beatty, never explained what changed her mind, just defended her decision as her own, and it was her own. That's what made Beatty's power so complete. He didn't force her to kill the story. He reminded her of who she was, and she killed it herself. By 1981, Warren Beatty had survived 3 major scandals that should have destroyed his career. Each time, the story existed. Each time, sources were solid. Each time, publication seemed certain. Each time, the story died. Not through lawyers, not through payoffs, not through threats, through phone calls to people he'd maintained genuine relationships with, through conversations that reminded journalists of their own integrity, through friendships that proved more valuable than any individual story. Other stars had publicists manage their image. Beatty had a network of journalists who'd decide on their own that destroying him wasn't journalism worth doing. And here's what made this power truly dangerous to Hollywood's traditional systems. It couldn't be replicated by people who viewed relationships as transactions. Studios couldn't buy this kind of protection. Agents couldn't negotiate it. Lawyers couldn't create it. It only existed when someone spent years building genuine relationships with no immediate benefit, maintaining those relationships after they ended romantically, and treating people well enough that years later those people would choose to protect them, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Warren Beatty changed how power worked in Hollywood by proving that the most valuable protection isn't legal or financial. It's being connected to people who'll make decisions that benefit you because they respect who you are, not because you forced them to. He wasn't loud about it, never bragged about stories that didn't run, never explained how scandals disappeared. Let people speculate about lawyers and money. The truth was simpler and more powerful. He'd treated people well for years, and when it mattered, those people remembered. So here's the question. In an industry where everyone tries to control their image through publicists and lawyers, where everyone views relationships as networking opportunities, where everyone calculates the immediate value of every connection, what happens when someone just treats people well for years, with no agenda? When someone builds relationships so genuine that years later, those people will protect them, not because they're asked to, not because they're paid to, but because destroying them feels wrong. When your protection comes not from power but from people who've decided you deserve protection. If that's the kind of influence that interests you, the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't negotiate, doesn't transact, just exists because you were decent to people when you didn't have to be, consider subscribing. We explore how real protection works. Not the version you buy. The version you earn by being someone people don't want to hurt even when hurting you would benefit them.